All right, here we go, everyone. Another awesome episode of the All Around Adventure podcast. And I'm excited to welcome back to the show my friend Chris Oldfield, who is the author of the book The Less Year and The Dogs of Nam. Chris, what's going on, man? Thanks so much for joining me yet again on the All Around Adventure podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, for having me. I'm glad to be here. Always happy to chat.
Yeah, this is a really good timing to get you back on the show because you've been really busy lately getting your next book out. You have released one book so far, The Dogs of Nam, which is your personal memoir where you're sharing some of your travel stories. And, some of the stories that you included in the book have coincided with some of your previous appearances that we've talked about. But now you are dabbling in the realm of fiction. You got The Last Year coming out, which is your post-apocalyptic fiction novel. But I guess kind of before we dive into that is just what actually inspired you to become a writer in the first place? Because we haven't really talked about that very much before.
Yeah, I never thought about or sort of never wanted to be a writer. It wasn't, when I was growing up, it wasn't like, oh, I want to write books or plays or whatever. I got good marks in the school, but, for me as a kid, from age, I don't know, 4 or 5 until grade 11 or 12 almost, I wanted to be a cop or join the army. Those were like my go-to career paths, which neither of them panned out exactly. But writing was never sort of on the radar. I did it in school and I got good grades, but it wasn't until university when, as a hobby, I started doing some writing on the side. I had, of all things, a few poems published in a couple of magazines and campus newspapers and stuff like that. And then I had some plays that I wrote, produced. And so that kind of like got sort of transitioned writing from like, oh, here's something I do for school to like, oh, here's something I can do like as a creative hobby and outlet kind of thing. Not a career necessarily, but just as like, here's something I can do like for fun if I want to.
Right.
And so, and then fast forward a few years later, and I was traveling more after university. And so that's when I started writing more as well, mostly for me, just like in a journal. And then I had like a hobby blog. And then that sort of led into my sort of 9-to-5 job for Nomadic Matt.
Right.
And so I do a lot of travel writing and editing for him. And so, but even writing for Matt on a travel website is still kind of different than like being a writer, as in someone who writes books, because writing travel blogs and editing travel blogs is still very different from being someone who writes books. And so I don't really think of myself as a writer yet. Maybe that will change. For me, writing is still like a passionate, creative hobby or like an outlet in the same way that like, I used to do martial arts. So I'd think about it like that, like, oh, I'm not going to join the UFC or like, anything like that. But like,
sure.
My few days a week, I go do this and it's sort of a necessary creative outlet for me. And so that's how I think of my writing for now. We'll see if that changes down the road. Who knows?
Right. Well, I think, just doing certain crafts like that, whether it be in the forms of like writing or anything creative, really, I think is just, once you commit to doing something like that, you pretty much are a lifelong student. I think it's just no matter like how much you've done it, you're always going to find new things that you're going to learn, new inspirations that are going to come along the way, or you're going to want to try to maybe branch out into different things. But of course, you kind of just coming from this background of travel writing, you had your personal blog, and then of course you were doing stuff in college, and then also with Nomadic Matt. It's just your travel experiences. How has that kind of sort of weighed into your journey as a writer? Has it influenced it in any way when it came to just like stuff that you're going to put out there, maybe character creation? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's definitely sort of influenced my writing in 2 separate ways. Just practically speaking, like working from home and being on the road means I'm always on my laptop and writing. And so,
sure,
I have this opportunity that I can write whenever I want. I make my own schedules so that, if I want to wake up and write first thing, I can do that. If I want to work and, go out and see some sights and then write at the end of the day, I can do that. So on the sort of the practical side, being a digital nomad or working as a travel writer sort of gave me the freedom to build my hobbies into my schedule in a way that really allowed me to write more and become a better writer. And then, yeah, on the opposite side, on sort of the inspirational side, I think the biggest takeaway is like having been to, dozens of countries now, but specifically countries that aren't quite as wealthy as, the US or Canada, countries that are still developing or struggling to develop, that have, experienced wars or have greater poverty, like those kind of scenes and instances and experiences have, I think what really sort of tie into my book, or at least have given me more insight into the struggles of people dealing with less, whether that's less money, less security, less safety. And so, having seen that firsthand, I think that really gives me sort of some better insights into what it's like dealing with these life and death situations that I'm writing about. Because obviously, I haven't experienced them. I'm not, living in a life and death situation, knock wood. And so my travels, and having a degree in history as well, sort of gives me some insight into, at least historically, how bad events have played out, and then getting to see them, or the effects of them in real life, I think has really colored my writing as well.
Yeah, there is, definitely a clear contrast, between hearing something like, let's say, in the news or on social media or whatever else, stuff that's filtered, for our eyes before it reaches to us, but actually being on the ground somewhere and seeing what, war and poverty and all these other things are affecting people like on the ground. It hits you in a much different and much harder way, I would say, once you're actually seeing this for yourself.
Oh, totally, without a doubt. I mean, even whether it's visiting concentration camps here in Europe or in Cambodia, visiting the killing fields, places where like when you read like, oh, like X amount of thousands of people were killed in this war, you think like, oh, that's bad, but like it doesn't affect your day-to-day living. You just go back to work or making dinner. But when you're there and you see it, and not only that, but you see the survivors, the people who were injured in these wars, or who were, missing limbs from landmines and stuff like that. It's like, then it really becomes sort of enmeshed in your own reality. You can sort of empathize and really see yourself in these situations. If you were born, just in a different country at even the same time, your situation in life could be vastly different and vastly worse.
Yeah, and I had my own personal experience with that. In my job as an archaeologist, I'm traveling to many different places to do field work. I went to Andersonville, Georgia, which was an old Civil War POW camp. And, I read about it before I actually went up there to do my fieldwork project, and just hearing about the immense amount of suffering and pain and death that was involved with that camp, but actually being on the ground where the camp was and seeing the boundaries and just thinking, like, though the area is not that big, but yet we're talking thousands of deaths just right there. It just felt so heavy just walking those grounds. And so, and again, it just kind of goes back to this thing where, yeah, you can read about it and you can learn about it, but then it's just once you walk away from your computer screen or whatever it is you're doing like this research on, it doesn't hit you quite as hard. But when you're on the ground there, it's a heavy feeling for sure. Totally.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing, right? Like it connects us to our past, for better, for worse. In ways that, learning about things in school can't. And so that's why, I always tell people, like, get out and travel as much as you can. It doesn't matter where you go or what you do, what your interests are. Like, as long as you get out and see parts of the world, you'll experience new things that you would never have even seen or read about at home, for better, but also for worse. You'll experience uncomfortable situations, but those in and themselves are kind of eye-opening and will help you sort of, learn about yourself while also learning about the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So living in Sweden, I mean, there's a lot that you could do, see and do in and around Sweden, just being there. But then, of course, as you've mentioned, you're still traveling quite a bit, just for, just work purposes and things like that. So what I'm kind of curious to ask you is just setting up your environment to write, because I think it's just, in some ways, it's like you need to eliminate distractions. You need to kind of just get yourself in a good frame of mind to immerse yourself in the story that you're writing. But it's just, I feel like if you're traveling all the time and you're in like, I don't know, hotel rooms or hostels or wherever it is that you might be staying, how do you kind of sort of create the environment wherever you go so that way you can write effectively without being distracted and be productive? I mean, because it's just, do you have just a couple of like core principles that you follow? I mean, what does that look like?
Yeah, so in a perfect world, when you look at like the big authors out there, Dan Brown, Stephen King, they have these like immaculate offices with like wall to wall libraries and stuff, and they look great. And so if you have a space like that, obviously it's going to be more conducive to writing. But my office here, we bought this house just before the pandemic, and fixing up my ugly office isn't a priority. So I don't even have a door on my office. So all day, I've got a 1-year-old toddler running in and out. I've got a dog, a blind cat, my partner, everyone's home. So, distractions are inevitable, especially. And then if you go out traveling, and so, well, I think it's helpful to build sort of a conducive, productive environment as much as you can. Learning to work through these distractions and difficulties is going to pay way more dividends down the road.
Right.
I worked on both my books at airports, on airplanes, buses, the back of cars, just like waiting for a train, and so, for me, the one thing I like to do, like the overarching sort of principle of my work as a writer is just write every day, or like work on your book every day. So maybe that means editing, maybe that means research, maybe that means like just formatting something, do something every day for that project, even if it's just 10 minutes, because that sort of keeps the fire going. It's if it's like fitness or something, if you just go to the gym once a week, you're not going to see as great a results as if you went more consistently. That doesn't mean you have to go for 4 hours a day and really just like pump up, but like, it's you have to put in that consistent effort in order to sort of see progress. And so that's sort of my principle for writing. Try to put in time every day, and that keeps it fresh in your mind so that you remember, oh, yesterday I did this is where I left off. So there's not like 5 or 6 days in between writing stints where you're like, oh, what did I even write? And then you got to go back and double check. So by putting in time every day, I'm sort of pushing that needle forward. There's I don't remember who said it. You're probably familiar with them. The person who says, try to get 1% better every day.
Right. I can't remember who said that either, but yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah,
exactly. It's if anybody Googles it, it'll pop up on social media right away. But, and so that's kind of my principle, like put in the work every day and just try to improve whatever you're working on just a little bit every day. And then over the course of time, whether that's 6 months, a year, 2 years, however long it takes, your project is going to be much, much better for it. At the end, it just comes down to, you got to have at least some discipline and you have to have some passion, because when you start a new project, whatever that project is, whether it's, you're training for a marathon, or, you just joined a new gym or martial arts class or whatever, you're going to be passionate at the start, just like in a relationship with a person, those first few months are great. But eventually, you're going to fall into a routine. And so when that passion fades, you have to have discipline to sort of pick up the slack. It's when I go into work every day, I love my job, but some days I'd rather just not work. But that's not how it works. I have to go into work no matter what.
I know that feeling. Yeah.
So for the days when you don't have the passion, you need to have the discipline to sort of fall back on. And so that's kind of my sort of the way I tackle things. Because sometimes, writing the first draft of the story is exciting, because even I don't know where it's going to go. I have an idea, but the characters will change and the story will change, and I'll come up with new ways to kill people, or to, fights to choreograph or whatever. And so that's fun and exciting. But then I have to go back and edit it, which is not as fun as exciting. And so that's when the discipline comes in, to be like, okay, well, you have to put in your work. You have to put in a little bit every day, even if you don't want to, because at the end of the project, when you reach that finish line, you're going to be much happier with the product.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, you have to know your why. And that's another quote that I can't remember who said that. It's just, know your why for doing something. So that way, when you do have those days where you don't feel like putting in like the extra effort or doing, what it is that you need to do in order to move the needle forward on your project. Remembering your why is what's going to help propel that along. And of course, in tandem with discipline and habits and all that stuff. But that's like an entirely separate podcast in and of itself. Because like for me, when I was hiking across Michigan last year, like I had to hike 1,200 miles to complete the entire trek. And it took me 3.5 months to do of just consistent walking day in and day out. And, there were a lot of mornings where I'm in my sleeping bag. I'm nice and warm. I can hear the snow hitting my tent. The last thing I want to do is get out of my sleeping bag and actually go face the cold like that. But, my why for doing was the trek was pretty strong. It's like, I'm trying to raise money for a nonprofit that I believe in to help my fellow veterans. I mean, that was what was in the back of my mind the whole time. And that's what got me going. So I guess just for you as a writer, and of course, like with your upcoming book, The Less Year, as you've mentioned, this is a hell of a process to actually pull off, having to either do the research or draft the outlines to, talking with editors and publishers and other stakeholders that have a hand in this as well. So I guess, what was your why overall that just kind of again, kept you going on those days where the last thing you maybe felt like doing was getting in front of your computer after a long day's worth of work to just do more writing? So what was your why overall, man?
Yeah. So for this project, for me, it was something I couldn't not do. I started, so The Less Year actually started as a blog, maybe around 2010 or 11. And the blog is still out there. I don't have access to it because I lost that email, a decade ago.
Oh, man.
But it started as a blog in a very different format. And so I had this idea for The Less Year and started writing it and probably wrote, I don't know, 50 or 60 pages worth of stuff. Some of it I kept, most of it was garbage. But, the idea started then. And so over the years, I've always kind of gone back to it, but, fiction really wasn't my forte as a writer. But after I wrote The Dogs of Nam, I was like, well, now, that project, I spent a year working on it every single day, if not more. And so I just had this gap, not just in time, but like a sort of a creative gap. Like, what am I going to do now? Like, I put all this energy, the book is out there, it's done, I'm happy with it. So what should I do now? And so that's when I was like, oh, The Less Year, like maybe I'll go back and just check that out and see. And then I started thinking about it more and more. And then it just became sort of obsessive. I was like, oh, I really want to like, not just write this book, but like see where this story takes me. Because so I read a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction. And there's not a lot of it in sort of the niche that I want. There's books like The Hunger Games, which are great, but they're for young adults. Right. And there's a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction that happens now where people, usually it's like an ex-military guy. And they take place in the US. So there's like guns and like an EMP goes off and, sort of high tech stuff. And that's great, but that's not like what I was looking for. And so I wanted to write a book that like I wish somebody else wrote. Like, here's a book for me that like is for adults. So there's swearing and lots of like, not gore, but it's like a lot of people are getting killed brutally. Mm-hmm. And, so it's for adults. It's like a rated R book,
Gotcha.
And so, but it takes place in the future where in kind of a low tech environment. So kind of like a Wild West, like The Purge meets like Deadwood. And so that's what I was kind of looking for, like a book sort of in that sort of niche, which I've never found one. So I was like, well, I'll just write it and I'll just see where it goes. And that will like give me a project to work on it and let me sort of see if I can write a novel. Because writing, in my experience, like writing travel memoirs, like that's kind of easy because I'm just writing down what I remember. Like, oh, right. This happened. I write it down. I make it sound better. Maybe I fudge some of the facts to make the story funnier or whatever. But like, I'm just writing down what I saw. Fiction writing, you're creating a whole world from scratch. Which I realized is much more difficult, much more sort of engaging and entertaining when it's done, because now I've got this sort of like almost like a video game world I can like enter and think about where there's rules and places and characters. And so it's a fun sort of like thought experiment. But getting it off the ground was tricky. But, my why was just like, I want this for me. Like no one else is doing this. I think it should exist. So I'll just do it. And then, and then I set a deadline. I mean, going back to what you were saying about your hike, like one of the things about situations like that is once you put yourself in that situation, you can't, like, if you wanted to be like, oh, I'm just going to quit, like, well, then you just got to walk back. Like, you can't just, like, you know, in the middle of like your hike, you can't just like, oh, I'm just going to hop on the bus and go home. Like, you're out there. And so you either got to keep walking or like turn around. And so it's easier when you have the momentum to keep going. And so I gave myself a deadline. I was like, okay, the book's coming out on December 1st. So now, like, that's my finish line, and I just have to keep walking. Otherwise, I got to turn around. And so having that sort of deadline, at least a deadline that wasn't too near, also sort of gave me sort of a push to keep going because you know I had to.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, the post-apocalyptic genre, of course, when it comes to writing and, you know, any realm of fiction, you know, you got a lot of different genres like you can pull from. I mean, honestly, I kind of pictured you as more of a murder mystery type of writer, but potentially, I'm not sure why, but that's just kind of what came to mind. So, and, you know, you and I, we've kind of sort of talked about this a little bit because, I mean, you and I, we kind of are sort of in the whole prepper thing. You know, we've talked about that a little bit offline, but I guess it's just what actually spawned this original fascination with the post-apocalyptic genre, completely up to the point that you actually want to write an entire novel about it.
Yeah, you know, I don't know why that genre, you know, sort of is one that I've enjoyed the most, because the first sort of post-apocalyptic or sort of dystopian kind of book, more dystopian, it was 1984 that I read in high school, and I was really impacted by it because, you know, when you're in school, almost all the books you read is like, oh, bad things happen and the good guys win. Bad things happen, the good guys win. And same with movies. When, you know, you're growing up, like most kid-friendly or at least teen or preteen-friendly movies are like, bad things happen, the good guys win. And so when I first read 1984, and it's like, oh, the bad guys are winning. Like it really struck a chord with me. I was like, oh, I didn't know that was like a thing that could happen like in books or in movies or whatever, in any sort of art. And so that's kind of when I got thinking and sort of kind of got, you know, sort of at least on the path of like, oh, what happens when bad things happen and the good guys don't win, you know? And so that sort of thought experiment has sort of pushed what kind of books I read. For this project, I wanted to sort of, you know, write a book sort of in that theme. Like, here's a book that, you know, I think could have been a young adult book and like bad things happen, the good guys win. But what happens if we flip that on its head? Like, bad things happen and the good guys, you know, aren't winning and the good guys are actually dying. Like, what then? Because to me, that rings more true to reality or history. You know, it's, you know, bad things happen around the world all the time and the good guys don't always win.
Right.
And so, you know, reading books like that to me just felt more accurate. And then, of course, you throw in the end of the world stuff because it's fun to think about zombies and, you know, other
sure,
sort of end of the world sort of thought experiments, you know. But and then, you know, being a farmer sort of led into me being a prepper, and sort of that also, I think, influenced my sort of like my sort of look at or interest when it comes to fiction and stuff as well. And also like sort of how I fit that into my books as well, because it gives me a chance to combine sort of like two hobbies in a way.
Right. Well, it's just as unfortunate as it sounds. Like, yeah, in reality, the good guys don't always win. So, and, you know, we've seen this throughout history and even sometimes in current events, too, where it's just, things don't always pan out for the better, too. So I kind of hate to say it, but sometimes the whole post-apocalyptic genre might hit a little bit closer to home in this day and age than maybe it has before, especially with like things like our reliance on technology. And we see things like, you know, power grids being taxed and, you know, so on and so forth, too. I was kind of thinking about this a little bit. One of the other authors that I like to read is Kyle Mills. He is kind of he took forward the Mitch Rapp series, like, you know, the CIA operative, who's one of my most beloved fictional characters. And there's a particular novel called Total Power, where in the book, a group of terrorists successfully blacken out America's entire power grid, like just plunges all of America into the dark. And what they were talking about in the book was that within about a year after a total blackout event like that, about 90% of the population would be dead because of our reliance on technology. And I was reading that. I'm like, this is scary, but I hate to say it. I wouldn't say that that's entirely an impossibility either, so.
No. And it's funny because there's a whole subgenre of post-apocalyptic books all about sort of EMPs or grid down scenarios. And it's wildly popular. Usually in the top 100 books on Amazon for post-apocalyptic fiction, there's at least a dozen or more like EMP and like sort of grid down books, because it is something that's like very possible and very easy to imagine. Like, because we've all had power outages of varying degrees. I grew up in Canada and we had an ice storm that took our power grid out for days. And so it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to because they've experienced even power out for just a day. But then when you realize how possible it is, it becomes both more interesting as a story, but yeah, also it hits very close to home, which I think attracts some people and I think repels others. It's why a lot of people, like during the pandemic, I think I read probably 8 or 9 pandemic books, like fiction stories about pandemics. And a lot of people are like, oh no, like the last thing I want to read about right now is like some virus wiping out the world. But to me, it's the more realistic, the more sort of possible something is, the more I kind of want to read about it. If not just for entertainment, because it's sort of a thought experiment where you can be like, oh, what if this happened? Like from a personal point of view, like how would I respond in this situation? Even if it is a little far-fetched, like it's still a sort of a fun sort of thought experiment to see like, oh, what am I prepared for practically, as a prepper? Like how much food and water and gear do I have? But also like psychologically, like how would I fare in a grid down situation? Like a lot of people would not do well. I live out in the countryside. I'm not a particularly, high tech individual. So like situations like that, I'm like, oh, like I think maybe it would be kind of like, how would I adapt? What could I adapt? And so thinking about those stresses, to me is like a really fun project and why I love the genre.
Right. And I kind of, excuse me, I kind of go along as similar lines. Like, obviously with me being an archaeologist, I'm often thinking about like our, ancient ancestors and those that lived in prehistoric times well before, all the modern conveniences that we have now. So when I look back on it, it's just, for the vast majority of humans being on this planet, we lived without all these things. We lived without electricity. We lived without running water and everything like that. And we made it through thousands of years and beyond, millions of years of being on this planet without all these things. So it's just, we could revert back to it. It's possible to revert back to it, but it would be a hellish endeavor to do so because, again, we become so reliant on all these things, which again just kind of goes back to the realism of events like this, like these grid down events and these pandemic events and so on and so forth. So it's just it seems like you got a lot to go off of when it comes to putting together novels in the genre space like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's they say write what you know, right? And so I will say I have outlined a sort of a murder thriller book for later after I finish this trilogy. But, my thing was like, there's lots of like cool topics in that sort of space, but like I'd have to do a lot more research. Whereas with like my book, it's like, oh, like it takes place in the future, low tech, based in sort of a farming community. And like sort of they have to sort of be very sort of mindful of like their security and sort of be prepared for sort of situations without giving too much away. And sort of I'm like, oh, okay, like I know farming, I know prepping. So like that's kind of an easy write for me in terms of like, oh, I don't need to do a lot of research. I don't have to like, because like writing about an EMP book, well, I don't know a lot about EMPs. So I'd have to do a lot of sciencey kind of research there. And writing in the modern world, then I'm sort of confined to like modern weapons and modern vehicles, and I have to sort of learn more about sort of that kind of stuff. Whereas writing the future gives me sort of a clean slate where it's like, oh, I can change pretty much anything I want, and while still being realistic, right?
Right.
So it makes my job easier.
Gotcha. So, all right. Well, you just mentioned that this is actually going to be a trilogy that you're going to be working on. So, I guess just to kind of sort of cue everyone into the book and this trilogy that you got working, just can you kind of give us a little bit more of a synopsis? I mean, obviously, we know that this is going to be a post-apocalyptic novel, but can you give us more of an in-depth synopsis and also what can our readers expect? Because let's see, as we're recording, it is November 30th, which means tomorrow the book will be out there, and so by the time this episode goes released, the book will be available. So yeah, can you kind of cue us in on just the more of an in-depth synopsis on the last year?
Yeah, totally. So the last year is a post-apocalypse apocalypse, and so it takes place sort of hundreds of years from now, after we've sort of fucked over the world as we humans ought to do. And so things have collapsed, but people have survived. One of the few things we're good at as a species is surviving. And so
right,
people have survived. There's been little communities built up, kind of frontier style, kind of low tech communities. And so humans exist and civilization is to an extent coming back. Except a less year is coming and an apocalypse is knocking on their doorstep. And so every few years in these communities, every community isolates to keep the population in check. So no communities can interact, no more trees can be cut down, no more fields can be expanded. It's really a fragile kind of situation they're in population-wise, and just with the earth and water scarcity in general. And so every few years for the past century, these communities have been isolating, and bad things happen during these times. People die, but it keeps the population in check, and it allows people to sort of thrive to an extent. Flash forward 50 years, and there's been no less years. There's been things are looking great, things are looking up, things are getting better, and then out of the blue, a less year is sort of announced, and so we're focusing on a family during this time, and sort of a kid who's born, never having to experience a less year, and all of a sudden he's thrown into this first sort of end of the world situation. And so how does he adapt? How does his family adapt? Even, at a time when they were sort of expecting things to be relatively peaceful as it gets in sort of a end of the world situation.
Sure.
And so that's sort of like the framework of it. And then, yeah, so it's going to be a trilogy, sort of these books, I call them sort of like action adventure, kind of post-apocalyptic, but also like a sort of a coming of age story, but like violent, very violent. So, if you're looking for action and want books that are fast paced, but like there's a death toll, this isn't teen reading, they're not going to be reading this in any high schools. Then yeah, this is the kind of book for you.
Gotcha. All right. That does sound like pretty interesting. And I will say, kind of original too, where it's like, I mean, when you see like anything like post-apocalyptic, it's usually just like a complete total struggle for survival, where it's just like, other communities, if you run into someone else like from a different community, you kind of wonder, all right, should I kill this person? Because are they about to kill me? Are they about to take my shit? And things like that. But it's just to this point where it's just like you got communities deliberately isolating from themselves. And I'm sure maybe at some point in the trilogy, I'm just speculating here, that some people might try to break that mold, where they're going to actually revert to their more primal ways to try to steal from like other camps and stuff like that. So
yeah, most certainly things go awry right off the bat, and that's sort of like the question. The two sort of questions I was interested in looking at through this story are like, why do humans always repeat the same mistakes, right? Like because the problems right. that cause the less year are the problems we're experiencing now, whether that's war, famine, environmental collapse, things that we could deal with, but aren't. And these problems are still existing in the future. And then there's the interpersonal problems. Why can't, if there's enough resources for everyone, why can't we all just get along? Why are there always going to be some people who want more and some people who have to fight for less? And so that's kind of like the bigger questions I'm looking at through the lens of sort of this family fighting for survival, but also like, what is the cost of survival? Because as you're saying, like, if survival for your family means you have to kill your neighbors and take their things, like, what is it worth it? Like, and how do we make those distinctions? Because dying to protect your family is different than killing to save your family, right? And so how do these characters and us as readers, how do we think about those questions? Because what is survival alone enough, or should we be fighting for more than just the bare minimum? And that's kind of where the Less Year and its sequels will go, sort of looking at these big questions through the lens of one character and his family as they sort of fight and kill and die, just trying to survive.
Right. Yeah. So it looks like you're going to be doing a little bit of look into just humanity on a deeper level too. And even in just like, the human psyche, it does raise a lot of those questions. It's just like, what lengths would people go to, for survival for themselves, like in their families? And I would dare say pretty astronomical lengths in order to do so, because as you mentioned, it's kind of it just with any sort of like living creature, even in flora world, plants, will go to great lengths to survive just as well too. So it's just, everything is fighting for survival on some level. So
totally. And then the question, because, betrayal is obviously a big part of this story, as, some people will have more resources than others. And so like, then you get like, if somebody is betraying you, but just for them to survive, like, can you hold that against them? Like, does that make them a bad person? And what does that mean? Or like, so if you're, it's the age old thing of like, if someone steals to feed their family, like, are they actually a criminal? Like, and so, sort of asking these moral questions, obviously it's not like a philosophical book. We're not spending chapters and chapters debating these, but these are kind of like the questions I was thinking about as we go through this sort of adventure, and as a character sort of stumbles in and out of their own sort of survival situations.
Right. And then also just other research that I've been doing, because quick side note, and I don't want to steal, your spotlight here, but I'm actually doing research for a novel that I am thinking about writing. I'm not the best writer in the world, so this is going to be a fun experiment, but more on that later. But also just like the act of actually killing, like, because my character, he's never had to kill anyone before, even though he's well trained in order to do so. He's never had to do it, and then he's thrust into a situation where he ends up having to do it to save someone. And it's one of those things where it's like he was prepared to do so because he was trying to save someone's life who was about to be harmed by like a couple of criminals. But then he kind of has this question in his mind where it's like, well, crap. It's just he's not sure how to feel, because I think one of the things I was doing to research the book, I was reading the book On Killing by Colonel Grossman. He took a really big dive in just the psychological effects of having to take someone's life. And for the most part, humans were very averse to doing so. Like, you see this throughout history, where it's just, I think of like the Battle of Little Bighorn, where you had actually have people fake being sick to go to the infirmary tent, even though the infirmary tent was like in a very non-advantageous position. Like, it was very vulnerable to attack where this was placed, but they would still fake being sick just to avoid having to go fight, not because they were afraid of dying, because they didn't really want to have to go out there and actually try to kill anyone. And then you also see this with like, I was researching this about like bayonet attacks. When someone is like charging with a bayonet, you see a lot of like slashing and slashing wounds, but not like stabbing wounds that would guarantee a kill, And so it's like, why are they doing slashing motions rather than like killing motions? Well, it's probably because they actually didn't really want to plunge that blade into someone else to actually try to kill someone. So it was an interesting bit of research about just humans are naturally adverse to killing, like, fellow humans. But of course, you do have those exceptions. Some people really thrive on that, but it's just so it was kind of interesting. I'm sure maybe that might play into a little bit into your work as well. It's just, people want to survive, but do they really want to go to those lengths of actually having to, inflict harm on others in order to do so?
Exactly. And what happens when those two sort of groups clash, with the people who are good at killing, and if not enjoy it, but like are willing to do it, and the people who are trying to not do that and avoid it, eventually they're going to come into conflict. And what's that going to look like? Because if people who don't want to fight are forced to fight, you're going to get you're going to get conflict in one way or another, whether that's, head-to-head conflict or people sneaking around and stabbing people in the night or whatever. So there's all kinds of sort of conflict. But yeah, at the end of the day, for a violent species, we are very non-violent. And that what you were saying, I think that even held true up until World War II, where they looked at accuracy rates and troops would just like miss on purpose just because they didn't want to shoot somebody who was, running or on running away or running sort of in the distance. And so, yeah, we're very sort of social animals. But what happens when the social part breaks down and the animal part is forced to sort of come more into play? That's what I'm looking at and interested in. And can we come back from that? If everybody is forced to become a survivalist, a killer, can we even as a species recover? Or will those sort of traits and skills and trauma like impact where we move forward as a species? So these are all big questions, which I'm not saying I answer them in my book, but they're the questions that got me interested in this situation. Like, what happens at the end of the world?
Yeah, one thing that just sort of came to mind to me is just, like, is there a point of like no return where it's like if we get down to like a certain point, like if we get so low as a species, is there a way back from that? Like, so maybe who knows? I mean, I hope we never really get to that point in civilization where we would actually have to find that out or make that determination or set that benchmark. But you can't really say for sure.
Exactly. I'm cautiously optimistic about us as a species. But in the terms of my fiction and stories, oh, definitely. I'm definitely like leaning into we choose a path and there's no going back. So you just have to blaze forward the best way you can. And, sometimes even making the right decision won't feel good or won't be good. If you have two bad choices, you still have to make a choice. And so these are kind of the decisions that I've sort of sprinkled in the books as we go along.
All right. Right on. Well, kind of sort of shifting gears a little bit is just, having done this whole ordeal with like writing, we kind of talked a little bit about what this looks like from a practical standpoint, as far as, just trying to set up your environment and just trying to maintain consistent and things along those lines. But it's just, what were some of your like big takeaways just from doing like all this work now up to the point of actually getting it released to the public? Is just what have been some of your just like big takeaways, I guess, on more of a personal level, maybe life lessons that you've extracted from doing this? What kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, well, I think like on a personal level, I've really learned a lot about how I work and like what I need to sort of create a good workflow for me, specifically with writing. How for me, I like to write a lot of drafts and make smaller changes as I go. Sometimes I'll make big changes, but I think for the last year I had 20 drafts. So that's 20 times I went through the whole manuscript, and sometimes I was making big changes, killing a character or swapping the death of a character or something like that. And sometimes I was just editing and just like polishing sentences and stuff like that. But yeah, 20 times I went through the whole manuscript, compared to, I think, a friend of mine who's a professional author. I think he does like 3 or 4 because he goes and makes bigger changes. But, for me, I wasn't on a timeline up until, recently when I announced the deadline. So I had the freedom to sort of spend as much time tinkering as I wanted. And so I think, moving forward, I'm going to try to give myself as much time as possible to really go through, because I'm not on a deadline unless I make one. So giving myself the creative freedom to really work is something that I discovered in this process, and something that I'm going to keep moving forward. On sort of the grander scale, I've really learned to value having a creative outlet. Because I have my job and I've got my family here. And so I don't have a lot of free time like most people.
Sure.
And, as much as I love sitting down in front of the TV, I find having a creative outlet just gives me much more sort of, I don't know, it just gives me much more sort of energy and enjoyment because it gives me something to think about, when I'm, it gives me something in the back of my head that I can really sort of chew on, whether it's a practical problem, like, oh, I don't know how this scene is going to work and how are these characters going to, how the fight is going to work, or like a philosophical problem, like, oh, like, are humans good or are we evil, or does that even matter? Sort of stuff like that, that relates to the book, of course. So yeah, having a creative outlet, I think, is I think necessary for me at least, and I think for most people, whether that outlet is whether it's writing or reading or training for marathons or learning archery, whatever. I think everyone should have the time to do that. I think it's a luxury and a lot of people don't, but I think the world would be better off if we all had time to sort of pursue our passions in a way that I'm sort of commercializing mine in the sense that like I'm selling a book, but like I'm not this isn't my income, so I don't care how it does. I don't care if it sells 100 copies or 100 million, because it's not, for me, it's a passion project. And so I think having a passion project is an important part of my life, and something that I definitely encourage other people to find if they haven't found it already.
All right. Absolutely. Good stuff, man. So, so we got the book coming out, like we said, here pretty soon. By the time this episode goes release, it'll all be out there. So, so how do we find it? Like, where can we go get a copy? And then, of course, you got the Dogs of Nam out there in the world too. So yeah, where can we go to find your books, man? Yeah.
So the books are available on Amazon. You can also get the direct links at thelessier.com. That's my website. My social links are there too. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at CK Oldfield. And yeah, they're obviously very different books. One's a lighthearted, hilarious travel memoir. One is a gritty, grim, and violent post-apocalyptic story. So, there's something for everyone. But yeah, they're all on Amazon and on my website at thelessier.com.
All right. And I'll get,
and I will say, I'll just throw this out there. For anybody interested in either book, but because I know, financially, the world is kind of in a little shithole right now with inflation, and, there's a war just a few thousand kilometers away from here. So if anybody doesn't have the money, it's like, oh, I'd love to read this, but money's tight, shoot me an email from my website and I'll send you a free copy. Because as I was saying, for me, I just like writing and sharing my stories to people who are interested in reading them. So I'm not going to, the ebooks, like $3. I'm obviously not going to be making a fortune off this anyway. So I'd rather give it away and have people enjoy it. So if money's an issue, shoot me an email and I'll happily, no questions asked, give away as many copies as I can.
All right, man. Well, I'll also get all that linked up in the show notes for this episode, so listeners can go and find it there. So awesome, man. All right. Well, as we kind of start wrapping up our conversation here, I always like to ask my guests to issue a challenge to our listeners, because, you and I, we've talked about some stuff. We talked about some practical things that we can implement for like creative outlets and stuff like that, and travel and so on and so forth. But going along with that is, what challenge would you issue to our listeners today for them to go out there and start living a more adventurous life?
Yeah, I think for those who have a creative passion or creative hobby, whatever that is, whether that's something physical or sort of writing or whatever, my challenge would be to step it up, to work on it every day, get in that little bit of work every day. Don't just wait for ideal conditions. Just sit down wherever you are and do it, whether you can, because anything we can do more if we wanted to, right? Like, you don't have to go to the gym to work out. You don't have to go to the track to run. You don't have to go to, like, I live out in the sticks. I can just go out and shoot my bow instead of going down to the archery range, so we can do more if we really want to. So my challenge would be to try to get in something every day, even if it's just, 10 minutes. Yeah, I guarantee it will make a difference.
Absolutely. And really just stop waiting. I think that really holds a lot of people up. They're just waiting for the stars to align just right for them to go out and start something or to go do something. It's just, it's never going to, be ideal for you. No situation is going to be ideal. Just go get started. Exactly.
The stars will never align. There's a quote or phrase, I think, perfection is the enemy of the good, or, perfection is the enemy of good enough, and so, Nike really nailed it. Like, just do it. Like, doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't even have to be enjoyable necessarily, but it just has to get done. And so, yeah, just go out there and jump in.
Absolutely. All right, man. What I have for you next is my final three. And you've answered these three questions before, of course, because I ask all my guests these questions at the end of the episode. So you're going to get asked these once again. I'm curious to see if your answers have changed. Of course, then again, I didn't really look back on our previous conversation to see what you said, but here we go. And the first of those three questions is, what is your favorite place that you've been to so far?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this recently. And it changes all the time because it depends, like my favorite place for what, a favorite place to live, to relax. But the countries I always keep coming back to, Japan is high on the list, Vietnam, Mongolia. Those would probably be like the three, not necessarily. I mean, I lived in Japan for a bit, but like, the countries that I have the most fun traveling in usually are the places I want to live. The countries I want to live are like the boring countries where everything runs on time and, Sweden, Canada, Germany. But the fun countries are the ones where things are hectic and it's really, you're really kind of on your toes. So yeah, Japan, Vietnam definitely would be some of the top places I've ever been.
Gotcha. Right on. All right. And the next question, what is one thing on your bucket list that you have yet to do?
Oh, it's a growing. There's, for every one thing I cross off, there's two or three that I add on. I'm hoping next year, the year after, to get up to northern Sweden to hike the King's Road, called the Kungsleden in Sweden, and it's a 400-kilometer trek. So I'm hopefully going to do that with my son in a backpack. So that's going to be a little extra challenge. And then ideally, my big one, which I'm not going to do with a 1-year-old, but is the Appalachian Trail. That's kind of like, I'm thinking maybe when he's older, like a father-son 5-month backpacking trip kind of thing. So hopefully, if my knees hold out, that'll be down the road.
Yeah. Just keep them moving, man. Keep those joints lubricated as with that motion. So right on. All right. And the last of these three questions, and this is a two-parter. What is your favorite animal, and have you seen this animal in the wild?
Yeah, and so this is another one that changes depending on my mood. I'll go with wolf, and I have not. I live on an island, and there was one here. There were reports that a wolf was on the island a couple of weeks ago. Every few summers, like you'll hear like, oh, a wolf got on the island. But I'm looking at my backyard, and there were deer here about 10 minutes ago, just eating. And it made me think of the wolf because I was like, oh, it would be so cool to see a wolf just like run in. Not that I want the deer to get ripped to pieces, but I'd love to see that wolf while it's on the island. So no, I grew up in Canada, and we had coyotes where I lived, and sometimes you could hear wolves, but I was just too far south. So hopefully one day.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, from a distance, because I feel like if you're really close from a pack of wolves and they see you, it's just like, I mean, bad times.
Yeah. I saw the movie The Gray. No, thanks. I would not stand a chance.
Right. Absolutely. All right, man. So before we call it a day here, let's just recap one more time where our listeners can go to connect with you, where they can go pick up a copy of the book. So yeah, man, what do you got for us?
Yeah. So again, both my books are on Amazon. You can get them on Amazon.com or .ca or whatever Amazon site is nearest to you, and at thelessier.com. And then you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at CK Oldfield.
All right. And then, like I mentioned, I'll get all those linked up in the show notes for this episode so the listeners can go and find them there. Well, Chris, I want to thank you very much for joining me on the show yet again. I always like having you on, and I appreciate our talks and our friendship. So, yeah, man, thanks for being here, sharing all your insights with myself and the listeners today, man. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always fun chatting about the end of the world. So, thanks again for having me. And I'd love to know what people think. So if you check out my book, don't hesitate to reach out, because I could obviously talk about the end of the world or prepping, nonstop. So don't be a stranger.
All right. Right on, man.